From San Francisco, it's Grumpy Old Doc with Dr. Gene Bede.
Hello, this is Dr. Gene Bede, and welcome to the Grumpy Old Doc. Today's show is going to be a little bit about the opioid or opiate epidemic that obviously is a huge problem in this country, and specifically about one aspect of the opioid epidemic, and that's how some pharmaceutical companies became drug dealers and created addicts. Let's start off with a few definitions. I hear the terms narcotic, opiate, opioid. How are they different? They're pretty much the same. The original opiate was opium. Opium, natural product, basically the dried sap of the opium poppy, smoked for time immemorial and was well known as a pain reliever and a sleep inducer. It is the original narcotic, of which all the drugs we're concerned with today are a member of. Narcos, the Greek god of sleep. Morphine, heroin, codeine, oxy, opana, Vicodin. These are all narcotics. Meth, crack, coke, pot, ecstasy. Those are not narcotics. So that's the definition. Opioids are things that really come out of a lab. Opiates are things that people distilled out of opium, out of raw opium. And the first one was morphine, 1810, a huge breakthrough over opium in terms of its purity, pain-relieving properties. It made a bunch of conditions way more palatable for people, including surgery. There was no general anesthesia back then. So when you take a look at President Polk, when he was a young man, he had surgery to remove a kidney stone. Wouldn't pass, they had to cut him open. There was no general anesthesia. He smoked as much opium as he could, drank as much whiskey as he could, put a lead bullet between his molars on either side for something to bite down on so he wouldn't crack a tooth, and he was held down with ropes while the surgeon cut out his kidney stone. So you can imagine the introduction of morphine, considering it came 60 years before chloroform, was a great breakthrough. By the time Civil War rolled around and a whole bunch of soldiers came back home addicted to morphine, it was clear morphine represented a problem, that it was addictive. What does that mean, that it was addictive? I'll digress for a minute. Addiction. What does that concept mean? Well, you hear people, oh, I'm addicted to Facebook. No, you're not addicted to Facebook. We're going to talk about addiction in the context of the brain, but also in the context of the body. So it's very clear that substances like nicotine and marijuana and cocaine and speed are addictive. They change, and alcohol. They change the way the brain works, and people start seeking them out, even if it's harming themselves in so doing. Odd that harm would bring pleasure, but nevertheless it does. And that's about as good of a definition of addiction that works for me. Somebody that continues to use something obsessively even though it's harming them. That's what they get pleasure out of. They get pleasure out of that kind of self-harm. Physically, there are other characteristics of addiction to these various drugs. Notable is withdrawal. The presence of some medical condition that arises with physical symptoms because a drug is stopped to which a person is addicted. And it may be pretty mild. For years, people didn't think there was any addiction and any withdrawal to marijuana. Clearly, there's an addiction. People say, oh, it's a psychological addiction. Now that we have such more pure marijuana, you talk to people that have gone cold turkey after being daily, heavy, chronic smokers, and they will tell you night sweats, nausea, vomiting, all sorts of things happen to them. But nevertheless, people really don't die from withdrawing from marijuana. They do from alcohol. Heavy drinkers that are drinking a pint of hard liquor a day, for years they stop doing it. Bad things might happen to a small percentage of them. People that take speed, not occasionally, but people that are really addicted to speed, and again are pretty much using it as continuously as they can afford to, if they stop it suddenly, that can represent a medical emergency as well. Barbiturates, which aren't really used that often anymore. But opiates, they're the poster child. They're the original addictive drug. Opium was regarded, and alcohol, were the original addictive drugs. What happens to you if you stop an opiate? Well, you will have physical symptoms, kind of like you have the really bad flu. And you'll have that whether you feel you're addicted, whether you've been taking it for a really long time or just a slightly extended time, you're going to feel it. Whether you liked the effect of the narcotic or not, you're going to feel the withdrawal. When I was a younger man, but nevertheless an adult, I contracted mumps from a patient. Incredible, intense pain. I really needed narcotics. I think I needed them for like 11 days before I could tolerate. Although I was happy to be off them and my head clearing and getting better, I felt symptoms of not getting those pills anymore. This stuff it's heavy-duty stuff. Now, I'm not saying I should not have gotten narcotics. I probably would have put a bullet in my head if I hadn't got them. This is blessed stuff, but it's dangerous stuff. It's nitroglycerin, folks. By the late 1800s, it was recognized that morphine addiction was a huge problem, but it was pretty much overwhelmed at the time by the huge social problem of whiskey addiction, public drunkenness, violence related to alcohol, which was actually far worse than it is today. A drug called heroin, invented in the United States, stolen by the German drug company Bayer, and given the name heroin. Isn't it wonderful how all these things are named narcotics? Greek god of sleep, narcos. Morphine, Greek god of dreams, Morpheus. Heroin, a heroic drug because it has a unique property. It's more potent in pain relief than morphine, and it's a cure for morphine addiction because if allowed access to heroin, morphine addicts will abandon their morphine. Of course, today we know it's because heroin's more highly addictive than morphine, but back in the day, starting in the 1890s, our good friends at Bayer in Germany, who, let's footnote this, should also be remembered as our good friends that created Zyklon B gas that was used in the World War II concentration camps run by the Nazis to exterminate people they didn't like. So besides Bayer serving that important social function, they heavily marketed heroin in two ways. One as a cure for morphine addiction, used IV, and the other one used orally to get you started early on a non-addictive cough syrup. They knew what was going on. They sold glass syringes and needles and little bottles of alcohol. They sold shooting kits to people over the counter in the drugstore. By 1920, the federal government realized this is a huge problem. We can't allow heroin anymore, and they outlawed it. But by then, the market had been created. So we have a long history of drug companies creating addicts and pushing dangerous drugs. When you consider how dangerous these drugs really are, it's very different than the drug companies pushing purple crack, which may be a drug that's taken too often, makes them an obscene amount of money, and has an unreasonable number of side effects if you don't have the proper symptoms. But that's very different than pushing heroin or some of their successor drugs, where you are creating addicts. You're getting your corporate profits by ruining people's lives. I really argue that there ought to be a higher duty, a higher standard of care for a corporation marketing a product as hazardous as these narcotics. Yet things really haven't changed. Now you can say, hey, people abuse these drugs. They lie to their doctors. They sell their pills on the street. How can this be the drug company's fault? Well, I think we already see that with Bayer, the initial poster child. But it still goes on today. It goes on to the point where we have created a huge epidemic for drugs not sold by the mafia on the street, but sold by the local pharmaceutical company through a drug distributor, through a pharmacy, to the addict. Right now, in Ohio, 1 out of every 5 people has a prescription from a doctor for a narcotic. They have the highest rate of drug overdose in the nation. One official there has seriously suggested that to avoid their emergency medical system from going bankrupt, they won't respond. They have a 3-strike rule. First time an addict overdoses, they'll come out. Second time, they'll come out. Third time, they'll let you die. That's how serious it has gotten. And how well has this played for the drug companies? Remember the drug companies' playbook. Minimize the risks of their drug to the doctor, to you, and maximize the benefit. Again, how do you behave when the drug you're dealing with, those characteristics of addiction and withdrawal, is what you're trying to drive sales of? And they drove sales. Take a look at the poster child for the modern opioid epidemic. OxyContin. OxyContin was originally billed as a way to safely treat patients with severe pain without getting them addicted, versus morphine, versus heroin, I guess. Does this sound familiar, this story? Heroin introduced to cure you from morphine. OxyContin's going to be introduced to cure you from heroin. Someday we'll talk about Suboxone. It's supposed to cure you from OxyContin. But nevertheless, this is a familiar playbook. They said, this stuff can't be abused. Obviously, it can, and it was. And that's evident in the sales. How can people be oblivious to the fact that a drug that sold $50 million in 1996 went to $30 billion today? Folks, that's a 60,000% increase. How many folks would like to have an investment with a 60,000% return on investment since 1996? Pretty good investment, I'd say. Very good investment. Good fellow by the name of Raymond Sackler is the fellow who pushed OxyContin through his company, Purdue Pharma. He died at age 97, I think proving that only the good die young. At least that's what the grumpy old doc is hoping. Today, the Sackler family is the 19th richest in the world with a net value of approximately $13 with $1 billion. So you see, these pushers do better than the guy sitting in prison in New York who's going to get fried by the government. And nobody's pulling these guys out of a sewer in 2 a.m. They're not hiding from the FBI. They're doing what they do in plain sight. Occasionally they get slapped on the wrist and they pay a fine of a couple $100,000. It seems like that sort of increase in volume ought to get somebody's attention, at least ought to get people asking whether they're doing the right thing or not. When drug distributors ship 9 million pills over a 2-year period to a town in West Virginia that has less than 400 residents. What the heck is going on? This is 2007, 2012. Who back then didn't know there was an opiate problem in West Virginia? Evidently the drug companies and drug distributors didn't, because they were happy doing the things they do, shipping more dope into West Virginia. How did they achieve such increase in sales? Couple things. One, this is a drug that sells itself. Man, you're taking a drug for your high blood pressure or high cholesterol. It's been proven. It's very difficult to keep you taking it. If you like OxyContin, though, there's no problem getting you to keep taking it. These drugs are addictive. As any pusher on the street can tell you, there's a value in free samples. Not only that, the drug companies are very skilled at manipulating data to, again, minimize the risks and maximize the benefit. All they got to do is a dine and dash with a doctor and give them the 5-minute spiel. And it's a pretty good spiel. There's no question that pain historically and recently has been undertreated in this country. Number 2, their pitch was that their drug was safer and less addictive than previous drugs. Number 3, doctors are now being rated by their patients, including on pain control. So, doctor, make sure you treat your patient's pain appropriately with the newest, safest drug so you get high ratings. And once you start treating people with this stuff, man, the requests for refills start coming through. And it swamped the doctors. Doctors are prepared to treat real pain, but they're not really prepared to treat addiction or people manipulating. And there are people getting more and more and more drugs. What do? Oftentimes, they simply refilled things, and refilled things more and more often. And doctors often don't have good answers to chronic low back pain, chronic neck pain, chronic pain after severe accident or injury. And the idea that these narcotics might be able to be used long periods of time safely without creating addiction was very alluring. And now we come to not my pet peeve, but we all know my psychotic hatred, triggered as usual by the Wall Street Journal, with whom you may disagree their political views, but they pretty much always get their facts straight. This morning's Wall Street Journal, I'm going to post it to the webpage, talks about a wonderful drug company by the name of Insys Therapeutics that misled people to approving treatment for their drug called Subsys, which is basically a spray that goes in your mouth that gives you fentanyl that is supposed to be used only for people who have advanced cancer